Good morning, how are you? Good morning, how do you do? Good morning, how are you? Good morning. Hi everyone, my name is Mr. UCN Khanyile, aka Awemah. I'm an educator at Busiswe Comtech High School in Umbumbulu, which is situated south of Durban. Okay, today's lesson will be on social justice issues, but the issue that we'll be focusing on is land reform. So what we'll do, we'll first start off with defining the concept land reform. What is land reform? And then we'll look at the strategies that the government use to bring back land. And also we'll look at the issues that need to be addressed before returning land. And lastly, we'll close off with the challenges for land reform. To be honest with you, I was very skeptical about discussing this topic or recording the video based on this topic because land reform is a very sensitive issue. So I don't want to end up stepping on the wrong toes. Okay, so, but yeah, I have no choice. It's part of the geography curriculum. So whether I like it or not, I have to cover it. Without wasting time, what is land reform? So what I can advise you to do is to pause the screen every time I display some notes so that you can have time to write down. Okay, so without wasting time, what is land reform? Land reform is defined as, according to Top Class Book, as to bring about equitable distribution of land ownership and access by changing the laws governing land ownership, access, and tenure. So I want us to focus more on the concepts that I've underlined, which are ownership, access, and laws. So we said this is a social justice issue. When you talk about justice, justice refers to fairness. Justice refers to equality. So we say land reform is about bringing about equitable distribution of land ownership. So we know during the times of apartheid that there was no equality in terms of land ownership. So the government that we have now is trying by all means to bring equality or fairness in terms of the ownership of land. That everyone must own land. Also, land access. We know there were times where black people were not allowed to go to some areas. There were areas which were marked as white-only areas. There were beaches, parks, and also bars where black people were not allowed to access. Okay, looking at laws, there are three laws that I'm going to mention. The first one is the Land Act of 1913, if I'm not mistaken. Act number 27. Okay, and also we have Group Areas Act. You've discussed these acts in social sciences in grade 8 and 9. Group Areas Act, where people were segregated in terms of their races and placed in different areas according to their races. Okay, and also we have the Native Resettlement Act. So for this one, I believe you all know the famous story of Sophia town, where people were moved away from that town. Some were taken to Meadowlands and different areas, and they were placed on those areas according to their races. So most of the land was owned by white people, and black people could only access a very small percentage of land. So government is using 3 or 4 strategies to reform land. So I've said land reform is about bringing about equitable distribution of land ownership and access. How? By changing the laws that govern the land. So I've mentioned the 3 laws, the Land Act, I mentioned the Group Areas Act, and I've also mentioned the Native Resettlement Act. So those were part of the laws that were changed for land reform to be effective. Okay, so the first strategy that government uses is land redistribution. So it's very important for you to be able to define these concepts. So as I've advised you before, you have to pause the video so that you can be able to take notes of the following. The first concept is land redistribution. Land redistribution. So what is land redistribution? So it's when the state, when you talk about the state, that is government, buys land and transfers it to landless people who cannot afford to buy it. So if you're thinking of land redistribution, we can think of, I think the good example can be RDP housing, where government is going to purchase land and then will build houses and then will distribute to those people who are not working or people who cannot afford land. Okay, moving on, we have land restitution. So land restitution is to restore land and compensates the individuals and communities who lost land during apartheid. So we know most people who used to own land, their land were taken away from them due to the implementation of the apartheid laws. So land restitution is whereby government look for those people who previously owned land or who their forefathers owned land, and they can come forward and claim land. So it's either they can be given their original land, or they can be given an alternative land, or if there are no other means, they can be given money to compensate them. The third strategy is land tenure reform. Land tenure reform is defined as to secure the rights of people living under insecure conditions on the land owned by others. So there is the land, and this land is not owned by those people, but they are free to do whatever they want to do on that land. Okay, maybe they can do farming, they can have a farm there, but on the land that they do not own. Okay, so the fourth strategy is the one that is very famous. We usually see it currently in our news, and that is expropriation of land. Expropriation without compensation. So expropriate. What is to expropriate? That is the forceful taking of land from the current owners. That is expropriation of land, or forceful taking of land from the current owners. So it's important for you to be able to define what is expropriation, and also to be in a position where you are able to say or to suggest what should be done in terms of expropriation of land. Is it a good strategy or is it a bad? What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of expropriation of land? We know some countries like Zimbabwe have practiced this expropriation of land without compensation, and we know the consequences they faced after that. And also some of the people who were given land ended up selling the land back to the white farmers. So it's a topic that needs to be discussed further. So moving on, we're gonna move to the issues that need to be addressed before returning land. So you can't just give people land, but there are some issues that you need to consider before returning land to people. So I believe you can all see the notes that I've written here on the issues that need to be considered before returning land. The first issue is to make sure that the land is developed so that the inhabitants can sustain their livelihood. You can't just give people land that does not have water or does not have electricity. Okay, so to ensure that RDP strategy, as I've mentioned before, is one of the strategies that ensures that the land is able to support the livelihood of the inhabitants, because they get houses, they have electricity, and also that have water and proper sanitation. Secondly, the environmental capacity of the land must be ensured that it can support the whole community. Thirdly, agricultural training and support happens in order to make rural areas productive. So there is no use of giving people land that they do not know what to do with. So you need to give them proper agricultural training, train them how to plow, how to do different kinds of farming. And then finally, government must be involved in funding the agricultural project. So as I've mentioned before, through projects like the co-ops, where a group of people can come together, people with the same vision can come up together with a project, and then government can fund that project. Okay, so like any other strategy, land reform has its own challenges. So what are the challenges of land reform? So as I've advised before, you can pause your video so that you can write down these challenges to land reform. The first one is the willing seller, willing buyer principle. So what is that all about? So willing seller, willing buyer principle has to do with the amount of money that the owner is willing to sell land with, and also the amount of money that the buyer is willing to spend. So that process can drag for years. So that can be a challenge to land reform being implemented. Also, the beneficiary. When you talk about the beneficiary, we are talking about identifying the rightful beneficiary, because there's a lot of corruption that is happening in the local governments, provincial governments, etc. So when identifying beneficiaries, sometimes this process cannot be done correctly, because you can find out that people who are well off, people who are working, can end up competing for the RDP housing with people who are seriously in need. So identifying the truthful or the rightful beneficiaries can be a challenge. Also, huge costs. So going to courts, this involves going to courts, it involves lawyers, it takes a long time. So this process can be very costly. And also, the claim disputes. So those are arguments. So it doesn't mean that since you have come forward and claimed that the land belonged to your forefather, that you'll be just giving that land easily. So it's gonna drag for a long time. You have to produce proof that that land indeed belongs to whoever you say it belongs to. So it's a very lengthy process. Different political views. So that can also cause this process to drag, and also the gaps in the policy. So policy is not like very tight. It's like it has gaps in it. So that gaps can compromise the correct implementation of the strategies that I've mentioned, which is the land reform, returning land back to people. So I've mentioned the definition of land reform. I've mentioned the land reform strategies, which involve land distribution, land restitution, land tenure reform, and expropriation of land. Also, I've mentioned the issues that need to be addressed first before giving people land, so that land reform can be effective. And also the challenges for land reform. So I've mentioned all of the challenges, and what you need now is to go through the notes that I've given you and study very hard. All the best during this time of lockdown. Thank you very much. This is Mr. UCN Khanyile, aka Awemah. Thank you.